Hello there, and welcome to Just About Earth, where curiosity settles into a warm chair and the distant questions of our species take on a gentler shape. Tonight, we're wandering into one of those questions that seems enormous at first glance, but softens once you sit with it for a while, like an old story shared beside a quiet hearth. We're taking a slow, steady walk into the idea of the very first civilization and what it might mean if the beliefs we carry today, in all their different forms and traditions, could trace their roots back to a single ancient beginning. Not in a dramatic or grand way, but in the calm, steady rhythm of people trying to understand their world long before history kept track of anything. Before we start unravelling this idea, I'd really love to know where you're listening from tonight. Not just the city or the country, but the feeling of the hour itself. Is it late enough that the world around you has fallen into that familiar hush? Or are you somewhere catching the last stretch of sunset, watching the sky shift toward evening while the day slowly lets go? Wherever you are, this is one of those topics that touches everyone, because no matter what you believe, no matter what traditions shape your days, the story of how humans learn to ask questions about the unseen is something we all share. It's one of the oldest threads we've carried with us, and if you find this kind of gentle wondering comforting, if the slow pace or the soft approach helps you unwind or drift a little toward rest, I'd be grateful if you gave the video a like or subscribed. It helps this small corner reach others who might need a peaceful place to think through big ideas without all the noise that usually surrounds them. This isn't meant to stir debate or push beliefs around. It's simply a quiet exploration of possibilities, guided by history, imagination, and the steady human habit of trying to understand where we came from. So, if you're settled in, maybe with a blanket or a cup of something warm nearby, let's ease into the idea. Because when we ask what might have happened if our religions were created by the first civilization, we're not rewriting anything or challenging anyone's faith. We're just looking gently at the world before writing, before recorded stories, before temples and scriptures and rituals had their names. A world where people lived close to the land, under skies that felt larger than life, noticing patterns they didn't yet have words for. A world that might have shaped the earliest ideas humans had about meaning, purpose, guidance, and the unseen forces that seem to move through everything. Most of us grow up hearing that civilizations rose separately in different parts of the world. Mesopotamia here, ancient Egypt there, the Indus Valley, China, the Americas, each with its own timeline and culture. And that's true, as far as archaeology can tell us. Human societies formed in multiple places shaped by local landscapes and climates. But there's a quieter question hidden beneath that timeline. What about the people before those civilizations? The ones who lived in small communities long before cities existed, long before farming and writing and architecture. What if there was a much older culture, one so ancient we barely have traces of it left, that began forming ideas about life and death, about the sky and the earth, about human nature and whatever they believed might lie beyond it? And what if those ideas didn't stay in one place, but followed groups of travellers who slowly spread out across the world over thousands of years? We know early humans migrated. They moved for food, for water, for safety, for exploration. They followed animals and seasons and coastlines, and along the way they shared stories. We don't have those stories written down, but we see hints of them in scattered cave paintings, carved symbols and burial sites older than most civilizations we usually talk about. Ancient graves with objects carefully placed beside the dead, collections of stones arranged in patterns, marks on cave walls that might have meant something to the people who made them. These traces suggest that early humans weren't just surviving, they were thinking, imagining, creating meaning, and whether those meanings were simple or complex, they mattered deeply enough to leave behind. So when we ask what if our religions were created by the first civilization, we're not imagining a big city or a government or anything like the civilizations we learn about in history books. We're talking about people who lived so far back in time that they barely show up in the archaeological record at all. People who may have shared a language long forgotten, a set of early practices, a way of seeing the world that eventually splintered into different paths. As their descendants spread out, those early beliefs could have changed shape in countless ways. One group might have emphasized the sky, another might have focused on the land. Some might have paid attention to the sun or the moon. Others might have built their traditions around ancestors, animals, or the cycles of nature. The differences would grow over generations, moulded by environment and experience, until eventually they became the distinct religions and mythologies we know today. It's a fascinating idea, not because it solves anything, but because it opens a door. It lets us imagine that behind all the differences, all the diversity, all the stories and rituals and symbols, there might be a shared origin point. A moment in deep prehistory when humans started asking the earliest versions of questions that are still with us today. Questions about why we exist, how we should live, what guides us, what happens when life ends. Questions so fundamental that they might have been present before the first city was ever built, before the first tool made from metal, before agriculture, before pottery, long before writing. And what makes this idea feel both enormous and strangely gentle is that it doesn't claim those early people were right or wrong. It doesn't rank any belief system above another. Instead, it makes every tradition feel like part of a long branching story stretching back tens of thousands of years. A story told in countless voices, changing and evolving, but rooted in the same basic human need to understand the world and our place in it. If there really was a first civilization or a first culture that shaped our earliest religious ideas, it likely didn't think of itself as creating anything. They weren't designing doctrines or planning rituals that would last for millennia. They were probably just trying to survive while making sense of storms, seasons, illness, birth, the movement of stars, and the mysteries they felt but couldn't explain. Imagine standing in a night sky without light pollution, seeing thousands of stars so bright you feel dwarfed by them. Imagine hearing thunder without understanding its cause. Imagine watching the moon change shape over weeks and wondering why. Imagine trying to explain grief or joy or fear to a child long before science existed. Under those conditions, early humans would have created meanings in the same way we create stories now, by connecting what we see to what we feel. If those early interpretations travelled with them across continents, they might have evolved into thousands of different forms, shaped by climate, geography, and local experience. One belief growing from another, generation by generation, until eventually the connection to the original idea faded but never fully disappeared. Like a word borrowed so many times that its origins become impossible to trace, or a melody hummed differently by each singer over centuries, yet recognizable in its rhythm when you listen closely. Even now, when we compare traditions from different cultures, we find surprising similarities. Flood myths appear worldwide. Stories of sky beings and earth beings show up in places that never met. Symbols like circles, spirals, serpents, trees of life appear again and again. These similarities don't prove a single origin, but they make the idea feel plausible, as if something old and shared lies beneath the surface. And so, as we begin this long exploration tonight, we're not searching for answers or forcing certainty where none exists. We're simply tracing possibilities, following the quiet clues left by people who lived long before us, letting the pieces form a picture slowly, without rushing to conclusions. And as we move from one idea to the next, we'll let the narrative flow the way the old stories probably did, passed from one voice to another, changing slightly each time, yet carrying the same underlying questions. If you're ready, let's wander further into this idea and see where it leads, not with urgency or finality, but with the same slow curiosity that guided those early humans when they first looked at the world and wondered what might be behind it all. When we try to picture the earliest people who began shaping the first ideas about existence, it's easy to imagine them as distant or unimaginably different from us. But the more you sit with the thought, the more familiar they begin to feel. They woke up to the same sun, you see. They looked at the moon as it climbed into the sky at night. They faced weather that confused them, seasons that changed without warning, moments of fear, small joys, the comfort of company, and the unease of being alone with their thoughts. In the long stretch of time before writing or cities or agriculture, people lived in groups, moved with the landscape, and carried everything they knew in their minds. Their stories weren't written, but spoken. Their beliefs weren't recorded, but remembered. And the world they walked through was full of questions without clear explanations, the kind that encourage you to make sense of things in your own way. If we follow them back far enough, we reach a point where the line between survival and meaning wasn't sharp. It was all blended together. They didn't have a word for religion. They didn't have institutions or organized teachings. They had the world in front of them. The cold mornings where breath hung in the air, the warmth of a shared fire, the rustle of animals moving in the distance, the way stars appeared every night without fail. These simple, repeated experiences were probably the first hints of order they recognized. Little signs that the world followed patterns even when they didn't understand why. And when you see patterns often enough, they start to feel important. Imagine waking each day knowing that everything you rely on, the food you hope to find, the shelter you sleep under, the health of the people you care about, depends on forces far bigger than you. You can't predict when a storm will hit, or why someone might fall sick, or why certain places feel safe while others never quite do. The earliest humans lived inside constant uncertainty. But uncertainty doesn't only cause fear, it also encourages curiosity. The unknown becomes something you think about, talk about, point to, and try to explain. Not with scientific instruments or formal theories, but with stories that grow from the experiences you share with those around you. It's easy to picture a moment when someone among those early people noticed something unusual. Maybe it was a strange shape in the clouds, or an animal behaving in a way that felt significant, or an unexpected alignment of stars. Someone might have given it meaning, even if the meaning was simple. Maybe they said it was a sign. Maybe they connected it to good luck or danger or a memory of something that happened before. And once that idea existed, even as a passing comment, it could have stayed in the group's shared memory. It might have been repeated the next time something similar occurred. Over time, these small pieces of interpretation would build on each other, forming the earliest versions of belief long before anyone realized they were doing it. Those early whispers of meaning didn't come from a single moment or a single person. They were shaped by countless conversations held around fires, during long walks, or in the quiet moments at dusk. They grew through repetition, shaped by reaction and retelling. When someone older in the group repeated a story, it carried weight. When children asked questions, the explanations might have shifted slightly, becoming more structured. Over generations, these small shifts could turn a general idea into a narrative into a tradition, and a tradition into something that lasted long enough to be passed to entirely new regions, as people travelled and settled in distant places. We sometimes think of early humans as primitive or unsophisticated, but there's no reason to believe their minds were any less capable than ours. They had the same ability to notice details, form memories, recognise patterns, and imagine possibilities. The difference wasn't in intelligence, but in context. Their entire environment encouraged interpretation. A sound in the night wasn't just a sound. It could mean danger. The movement of the sun wasn't just a cycle. It could signal when to travel or rest. A dream wasn't just a dream. It might have been seen as a message. When you live without artificial light, clocks, or modern technology, the natural world becomes your guide, and everything in it feels alive with meaning. If a first civilization existed, whether it was a small group or a network of communities, it would have formed beliefs not through planning, but through necessity. Not in temples, but in shared spaces where people gathered. Not through formal leaders, but through individuals who felt compelled to explain the world in a way others found helpful. This kind of early cultural structure doesn't leave behind clear evidence. Stone buildings and carved monuments come much later. The earliest beliefs would have been carried in people's voices, shaped by their experiences, and reinforced by the simple fact that they seemed useful. If an explanation helped someone understand their fears or encouraged cooperation, or gave people a sense of purpose, it had value. And valuable ideas tend to last. So what kinds of early beliefs might these people have formed? We can't know exactly, but we can make educated guesses by looking at the earliest shared symbols left across the world. Spirals carved into stone, burial sites with objects placed carefully beside the bodies, animal figures painted with deliberate care. These repeated symbols suggest that early humans saw meaning in death, in cycles of nature, in animals they depended on, and in forces they couldn't control. The first civilization, if it existed, probably didn't have complex pantheons or elaborate doctrines, but they may have believed in spirits connected to places, animals, ancestors, or natural events. They may have thought certain locations held special significance. They may have believed in a form of guidance, whether from the sky, or from memory, or from the land itself. These early interpretations wouldn't have been static. They would shift as people moved and new challenges arose. When groups travelled far from familiar landscapes, their beliefs would adapt to the new environment. An animal that once symbolised strength might fade in importance if the group no longer encountered it. A celestial event might gain meaning if it aligned with a major moment in the group's life. The beliefs were flexible because they had to be. They weren't written down, so they changed naturally with each retelling, becoming more elaborate or more specific depending on the storyteller and the moment. If this first civilization existed long before the ones we usually talk about, it might have lived close to water, since water supports movement, food, and survival. Rivers and coastlines would have shaped their paths, and wherever they travelled, they might have shared fragments of their beliefs with other groups they encountered. Some of those groups might have adopted the ideas, blended them with their own experiences and passed them onward. Over generations, these blended ideas could have formed the seeds of the many religious and cultural systems that later civilizations formalized. Consider how long humans lived before writing was invented. Tens of thousands of years passed where stories could only survive through memory. That's more time than all recorded history combined. If even a simple belief lasted through a fraction of that period, it would have evolved many times, changing shape with each generation. By the time it reached the earliest known civilizations, Sumer, Egypt, the Indus Valley, ancient China, it might have been transformed beyond recognition. Yet, underneath the transformations, connections might still linger. A focus on the sky, reverence for certain animals, ideas about the afterlife, rituals involving fire, water, or circles. These shared features could be the echoes of a much older source. We sometimes imagine ancient religions competing with each other, but their earliest versions likely didn't feel competitive. They weren't structured systems, they were ways of making sense of life. If a group met another with different interpretations, they might have exchanged ideas, adopted new ones, or blended them without conflict. There wasn't a sense of exclusivity or contradiction. People weren't defending doctrines, they were exploring possibilities. This freedom may have allowed early beliefs to spread across vast distances without resistance, carried naturally by travellers, families, and small communities moving in search of resources. If we follow this idea further, we can picture how a single set of early beliefs, formed by the first civilization, could eventually diversify into the wide range of religions and mythologies we know today. As groups settled in new environments, they faced new challenges. A people living near mountains might emphasize spirits of high places. A people living by the sea might place importance on tides or storms. A community that experienced long winters might develop rituals to mark the return of light. Each variation would build on earlier layers, creating something that felt unique but carried hints of a shared origin. Over time, these early belief systems would solidify. They would become traditions passed from elders to children. They would influence art, architecture, and social structure. When writing finally emerged, some of these beliefs were captured in texts that preserved them with a permanence they had never had before. But by the time they were written down, thousands of years of evolution had already shaped them. This makes it difficult to trace any belief back to a single source. The original ideas might be buried beneath countless layers of interpretation, reshaped by every generation that carried them. Still, the possibility of a shared origin remains intriguing, not because it simplifies anything, but because it reminds us that beneath the differences in how cultures express their beliefs, there might be a much older, quieter thread connecting them. A thread made of the earliest attempts to understand life, death, the sky, the land, and the mysteries that come with being human. A thread woven by people who lived in a world without modern technology, whose experiences guided their interpretations, and whose stories shaped the generations that followed. When we imagine those early groups gathered at the end of a long day, it's almost impossible not to picture a fire at the centre of everything. Fire wasn't just a tool for warmth or cooking. It was the anchor that brought people together. Its light pushed back the darkness far enough to create a sense of safety. Its crackling sounds filled the quiet moments when no one felt the need to speak, and its steady glow gave shape to faces, gestures, and expressions that might otherwise have been hidden in the night. In a world without screens, streetlights, or anything artificial, fire was one of the only things that changed the environment in a controlled way. It created a little world inside the bigger world, a place where ideas and stories could grow without interruption. If the earliest whispers of belief were shaped by daily experiences, then the fire at night was probably one of the first places where those ideas took clearer form. Think of the way a fire naturally draws attention. Its movements are unpredictable but calming. Its light turns ordinary surroundings into something slightly unfamiliar, something that feels different from the daytime. People relaxed around it, their minds drifting after a day of work or travel. In that environment, even small observations could feel important. The shadows created by flames might have seemed like movements or forms. The changing colours of the embers might have felt meaningful. For someone who didn't yet have scientific explanations for anything, the fire itself could seem like a living presence, something both helpful and mysterious at the same time. In those moments, the world outside the circle of light was equally influential. Beyond the reach of firelight, darkness stretched in every direction. Animals moved unseen. Night winds shifted. The sky filled with stars more numerous than most of us ever see today. People sitting by the fire didn't just stare into the flames. They also looked up, trying to understand the immense display above them. The night sky was impossible to ignore. With no cities to dull its glow, the stars were sharp and bright. They appeared in patterns that repeated every night, and their movements across the seasons were noticeable enough that even young children could track them if they paid attention. It's not hard to imagine how those patterns caught the interest of early humans. Someone might have noticed that a certain bright cluster appeared at the same time every year. Someone else might have tracked how the moon changed its shape and brightness. Someone might have pointed out that certain stars moved differently from the others, wandering across the sky instead of remaining fixed. Without scientific language, these observations still had meaning. They might have been interpreted as signs, reminders, or signals, not because early people were superstitious, but because the sky offered consistency in a world that was mostly unpredictable. When a group gathered together at night, watching the sky while sitting around a fire, they weren't just passing time. They were learning to notice the world. They were connecting dots without knowing they were doing it. They were forming early versions of questions humanity still asks today. Why does the sun disappear and return? Why do some stars move while others don't? Why does the moon change shape? Why do some nights feel different, even when everything looks the same? These questions weren't the beginning of religion in the modern sense, but they were the beginning of meaning. They were steps toward understanding that the world had patterns worth paying attention to. Over many generations, those patterns could become part of the group's shared knowledge. One person might remember which stars marked the time when animals migrated. Another might recall which moon phases were associated with successful hunts. Little by little, the sky became a guide. People didn't worship it at first, they relied on it. The early sky watchers weren't priests or prophets. They were observers who paid attention, passed on what they noticed, and helped their groups adapt to seasonal changes. And in doing so, they might have created the earliest versions of storytelling that tied celestial events to human experiences. Around the fire, those stories would have grown. Someone might have explained that a particular star appeared when food was plentiful, giving it a role in the group's understanding of survival. Another might have associated a long night with a time of danger or caution. Eventually, these connections could become narratives about unseen influences shaping the world. But instead of seeing these beliefs as superstition, it helps to think of them as practical tools. When you rely on the environment for everything, any hint of pattern brings comfort. A story that connects the stars to something familiar makes the world feel less random. And as these stories were shared, the firelight itself played a role. Its flickering glow made everything seem slightly alive. Movements of hands and faces appeared more dramatic. Shadows shifted in unpredictable ways. A storyteller could create atmosphere without trying, simply by speaking while the fire moved beside them. That combination of light, warmth, and sound helped ideas settle deeply in the minds of those who listened. Even now, stories told around a fire feel different. The environment encourages openness. It slows the mind in a way that makes details easier to remember. For early humans, whose memories carried the entire knowledge of their culture, that atmosphere was essential. As groups moved and separated over time, the stories changed. One group might have emphasized a particular sky pattern because it felt important to their survival. Another might have focused on a different one. Someone might have added a new interpretation to help explain a strange event. Someone else might have connected a memorable experience, like a successful hunt or a dangerous storm, to a celestial pattern they happened to notice at the time. None of this required formal structure. It grew naturally, shaped by human tendencies that haven't changed much over tens of thousands of years. We still look for connections, even if we don't realize it. We still remember stories more easily when they're told in the dark or shared between people who trust each other. We still find meaning in patterns because it helps us make sense of uncertainty. The earliest people didn't behave differently. They simply lived in a world where every pattern felt important because so much depended on being aware of the environment. The sky gave them a sense of continuity. The fire gave them a space to reflect. If those early groups formed the foundation of a first civilization, their shared moments around the fire and their observations of the sky might have been the earliest seeds of belief. Not structured systems, not fully developed ideas, but small, accumulating interpretations that eventually grew into something larger. The idea that the sky held influence might have come simply from paying attention. The idea that the fire had a presence might have come from hours spent watching it while feeling protected by its light. The idea that ancestors or spirits continued in some way might have come from dreams that felt vivid enough to believe in. Each of these early ideas was basic on its own, but together they could shape an entire worldview. People who lived in these early communities didn't think of themselves as creating anything new. They were simply trying to understand their world. Yet their experiences became the foundation of countless traditions that emerged thousands of years later. When we look at ancient civilizations and see temples aligned with stars, myths tied to celestial events, rituals centered around fire, and beliefs linking ancestors to natural forces, we're seeing possible echoes of these early behaviors. It's not that one group invented everything, it's that many groups, possibly descending from a shared cultural source, shaped similar ideas based on the same human responses to the same environment. The night sky, with its repeating patterns, might have been the first teacher. The fire, with its steady presence, might have been the first gathering place. and the stories shared between them might have been the earliest versions of meaning that eventually formed the basis of the religions we know today. Not intentional creations, but natural results of curiosity, memory, and experience. These elements didn't need to be formal for them to matter. They only needed to be repeated, valued, and passed from one generation to the next. As time went on, those early practices became more structured. People built simple markers to track the sun. They recognized patterns in the moon's cycle and used them for timing events. They created symbols that represented ideas their language didn't yet express. But all of these developments had roots in those earlier moments by the fire and under the sky, when meaning was just beginning to take shape. As people kept watching the sky night after night, something quiet but significant began to happen. The patterns they noticed didn't just stay as observations. Over time, those patterns began turning into symbols, and the symbols started carrying meanings that stretched far beyond what the eyes could see. This shift didn't happen because anyone set out to create a system or give a formal structure to their ideas. It happened because human memory works best when ideas have something concrete to attach to, something that can be recognized even when the details of a story fade. Symbols became a kind of bridge, helping people pass meaning from one moment to the next and from one generation to another. If we move slowly through the moments that might have led to this change, we can imagine how a symbol could begin with something simple. A group might have depended on a certain season to gather food or hunt a particular animal. If they noticed that a specific cluster of stars became visible just before that season began, the cluster might gain significance. It wasn't worshipped at first. It was just linked to an important event, but repetition can turn a link into a symbol. If the pattern returned every year and its appearance consistently signaled something that mattered, it became more than a set of lights. It became a sign people looked for, talked about, and trusted. Once a connection like that existed, it might have inspired others. Early humans didn't separate practical knowledge from meaning. If something helped them survive, it naturally became part of their understanding of the world. Over time, symbols tied to survival also became tied to stories. A star cluster could represent the start of a long journey. A bright single star might be associated with a memory of safety. A particular alignment might remind a group of an event passed down through generations. The meanings weren't rigid. They grew, shifted, and expanded as new storytellers added details or offered new interpretations. It's interesting to think about how much of this could have happened without anyone consciously deciding to create symbolism. Early people didn't have written language, so their memories had to do all the work. And memory, while powerful, often needs anchors, something visual, something repeatable, something shared. Symbols checked all of those boxes. They could be pointed at. They appeared regularly. They could be explained even to children who were too young to understand complex ideas. Over thousands of years, these early visual anchors might have become the seeds from which more structured belief systems eventually grew. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence supporting this idea comes from the artifacts left behind by ancient cultures that lived far apart yet used similar imagery. Even before fully developed writing systems appeared, people carved shapes into stone that seemed to represent more than simple decoration. Circles, animals, spirals, lines arranged in deliberate patterns. These marks weren't random. They were placed with intention, repeated often, and sometimes positioned near sites where people gathered for reasons that seemed to go beyond survival. Although we can't know exactly what they stood for, the consistency of these shapes across different regions suggests that symbols served as tools for communication long before writing existed. But perhaps the most influential symbols of all were the ones people saw in the sky. The constellations we use today come from later civilizations, but the idea of grouping stars into recognizable forms is much older. Early humans likely connected stars into shapes, not because they believed the shapes literally existed, but because the shapes helped them remember where certain stars were and what they signaled. A grouping that resembled an animal might have been tied to a season when that animal was important. A grouping that looked like a path might have marked the direction of migration or travel. These interpretations were practical first, meaningful second. but once they existed, they could evolve into stories that extended beyond their original purpose. Imagine a group sitting together at night. An elder gestures toward a set of stars and compares it to an animal they all know. The others look up and see the resemblance. From that moment on, those stars have a name. The name becomes a way to remember the stars, and the stars help the group remember the season or the lesson tied to the story. Over time, the story becomes more elaborate. It might begin including details meant to teach younger generations something important, like how to behave during a dangerous time of year or how to prepare for a journey. Eventually, the story becomes a part of the group's shared identity, and all of it came from a simple act of pointing at the sky and noticing a shape. As time passed, those symbols might have gained emotional weight. When something consistent appears every year, it can feel like a companion. Its return might bring comfort during stressful times. Its absence might create unease. People might begin thinking of these patterns as having intentions or influence, not because they were trying to create complex ideas, but because assigning intention to the world makes uncertainty easier to manage. If a star's appearance seems tied to a good event, it might feel natural to believe the star had something to do with it. If a sudden eclipse darkened the sky and frightened the group, the symbol of the hidden sun might take on a protective or cautionary meaning. None of this required formal beliefs or organized structures. It developed gradually, shaped by everyday experiences. When people moved to new regions, they brought their symbols with them, but different landscapes created different associations. A group travelling into colder regions might connect the moon's brightness to the challenges of winter. A group moving into warmer climates might associate certain constellations with rains or winds. These shifts didn't erase the original meanings, they simply added new layers, turning symbols into flexible tools that grew more complex with each passing generation. As communities grew larger and more stable, symbols became more central to daily life. They might be carved into shared gathering spaces or used as markers to signal important times of year. They could help people coordinate tasks, celebrate significant events, or prepare for seasonal changes. Over time, they began influencing rituals. A symbol might be drawn on the ground before a hunt. A certain object might be placed with the deceased to reflect a belief connected to a celestial pattern. A specific arrangement of stones might mark a location where the sun rose in a predictable way. These actions weren't meaningless. They were attempts to align human life with the environment, to create a sense of order in a world full of unpredictability. When early humans performed rituals based on symbols, they weren't just repeating motions. They were reinforcing shared memory. They were passing down knowledge in ways that could last even when individuals didn't. A symbol carved into a rock could survive far longer than a story told by a single voice. And as these symbols accumulated, they became part of the identity of the communities that used them. If we follow these developments further, we can see how symbols eventually became the foundation for more structured systems. When writing emerged in later civilizations, many early written characters were simplifications of older symbols. Some represented celestial patterns, others represented cycles, animals, or natural forces. These early written forms weren't just communication tools. They carried cultural meaning shaped over countless generations. They preserved ideas that had travelled through time long before people learned to write them down. So, if our religions today reflect echoes of the first civilization, many of those echoes likely come from the symbols created during this early period. Not because those people intended to create universal meanings, but because their lives depended on noticing patterns. And when a pattern becomes reliable, it naturally becomes meaningful. Over generations, meaning becomes tradition. And traditions, even when they seem unique to specific cultures, can trace their roots back to the earliest attempts to understand the world. One of the most intriguing aspects of symbols is how far they could travel without losing their familiarity. When people migrated across continents, they didn't just bring physical tools, they brought memories, stories, and symbols. Even if the stories changed with the environment, the underlying idea stayed intact. A circle might represent the sun in one region, and unity in another. A line might symbolize a path or boundary depending on where a group settled. An animal shape might take on different interpretations depending on the species present. But the habit of connecting symbols to experiences remained constant across the world. This consistency helps explain why distant cultures sometimes share similar imagery, even when they had no direct contact. They might have inherited the same ancient symbol and adapted it differently over time. A spiral might represent life cycles in one region and water in another. But both interpretations reflect natural patterns early humans would have noticed. A tree might represent stability in one culture and family in another, but both associations come from long-standing human interactions with nature. These similarities don't prove that every culture descended from the same source, but they make the possibility feel far more reasonable. When we think about how the heavens spoke in symbols, we're really thinking about how early humans learned to communicate with each other about the world they saw. They didn't receive messages from the sky in a literal sense. They observed the sky and created messages from their observations. Those messages became symbols, and the symbols became tools for understanding. Over thousands of years, these tools grew into belief systems that shaped entire civilizations. Even today, many symbols in modern religions and cultures can be traced back to earlier forms. Sun imagery, moon phases, stars, cycles, animals, and natural forces all appear in stories from cultures around the world. These similarities aren't accidental. They come from shared experiences that began long before recorded history. The first people who noticed the sky weren't trying to shape the future. They were just trying to make sense of their present. Yet their interpretations influenced everything that followed. As communities grew and moved across the landscape, the symbols and stories they carried didn't stay in one place. They travelled with them, woven into daily habits, spoken in moments of teaching, and shared in the quiet hours when families settled in for the night. When people began to migrate, the beliefs they held weren't packed away like tools or supplies. They moved through conversations and memories, passing from one person to another as naturally as breathing. Travel in those early ages wasn't fast or coordinated. Groups moved slowly, sometimes only a few miles at a time, following seasonal changes, food sources, or simply exploring areas they hadn't seen before. These long periods of travel gave stories the time they needed to spread and settle in new minds. For most of human history, migration wasn't a single event. It was a constant part of life. People rarely stayed in one place for long before agriculture. They followed rivers that shifted, plains that changed, and coastlines that offered new resources. A group might leave its original territory for reasons no one could predict. A drought might push them outward. A cold period might make their region difficult to survive. An abundance elsewhere might draw them forward. With each step, stories stretched farther from their original sources, and each retelling adjusted them slightly to better suit the new surroundings. Imagine a family moving toward a new region, carrying their possessions, guiding their children, and relying on memories to keep traditions alive. At night, when they set up shelter and sat together, someone would repeat a story tied to a symbol from their old home. But the meaning of that symbol might shift as they encountered different landscapes. A constellation associated with hunting might take on a new role if the group moved somewhere hunting became more challenging or less central to survival. A symbol carved into a piece of wood might be explained differently to children who had never seen the region where it originated. These changes weren't intentional. They were the result of adapting old ideas to new circumstances. As groups continued moving, they inevitably crossed paths with other communities. These interactions weren't always dramatic or confrontational. Sometimes two groups might share a meal or exchange goods. Other times they might observe each other from a distance, and occasionally individuals might join together, forming new social ties. In all of these interactions, there were opportunities for stories to mix. One group might share a symbol that sparked interest in another. A simple explanation might be repeated later by someone who remembered only part of it, creating a new meaning altogether. Over time, the boundaries between different sets of beliefs became blurred. Two groups that started hundreds of miles apart could eventually share similar myths without ever knowing they had influenced each other. The landscapes people travelled through played an important role in how myths changed. A mountain range might inspire a story about strength or endurance. A wide river might become associated with renewal or transition. A dense forest might encourage stories about hidden beings or unknown dangers. Every environment offered new experiences that could blend with old beliefs. A symbol that once represented a small hill in one region might grow into something much larger if the group later encountered towering mountains. The meaning followed the group's emotional response to the landscape, not the landscape itself. As a result, the same symbol could take on different associations depending on where the group settled. Over thousands of years, these shifts added up. By the time early civilizations began forming permanent settlements, stories had travelled across vast distances, carried by countless migrations, each adding small adjustments. Some parts of the story survived unchanged, especially the ones tied to universal experiences, like the cycle of the seasons or the fear of storms. Other parts shifted so much that they barely resembled their origins, but the habit of connecting celestial patterns, animal behaviours, and natural cycles to meaning remained consistent. That habit might have been one of the oldest cultural threads humans shared, stretching back to the earliest groups that first gathered under the stars and around the fire. What makes this migration of myths so important is that it didn't rely on written records or formal teaching structures. It relied entirely on human memory and human connection. People told stories because they mattered to them. They repeated them because they helped them understand the world. They taught them to their children because they believed the stories could help them survive. The more a story seemed to help, the more likely it was to survive through generations. And when a group moved, they brought those useful stories with them. Sometimes symbols and myths would change because of practical needs. If a group moved from a region with harsh winters to one with mild seasons, the story tied to winter might become less prominent. A myth tied to a certain animal might fade if that animal no longer lived in the new region. But sometimes the opposite happened. A group entering a new landscape might create entirely new stories based on experiences they'd never had before. These new ideas could blend with older beliefs, creating hybrid forms that combined memories of the old world with the realities of the new one. This slow, steady blending is one reason why so many cultures across the world share similar mythic themes. Flood stories, trickster figures, sky beings, underworlds, cycles of death and rebirth, and creation myths appear in regions separated by oceans and continents. These similarities aren't proof of a single original religion, but they support the idea that early humans shared similar experiences as they migrated. Those experiences produced similar interpretations, even when the details differed, and if there was a first civilization whose symbols and stories spread outward, those early fragments could have influenced groups that eventually developed their own distinct traditions. Migration didn't just move stories, it moved people with specific skills. A person who had a talent for storytelling might become valued in a new group. Someone skilled at tracking stars might share their knowledge with people who had different regional markers. Someone who carried an object with symbolic weight might introduce its meaning to others who had never seen anything like it. These exchanges helped spread beliefs to areas far beyond the original homes of the earlier storytellers. One of the most fascinating aspects of ancient migration is how much of it occurred in ways we can't fully trace. Archaeological evidence only captures a small portion of human movement. Items that survived long enough to be found don't represent the complete picture. Myths, on the other hand, provide clues that stretch far beyond physical evidence. If two distant cultures share similar story structures, it could mean they both inherited pieces from the same ancient source. Alternatively, it could mean their early environments encouraged similar interpretations of natural events. Either possibility supports the idea that early humans naturally created and spread meaning in ways that shaped civilizations long before cities appeared. As groups settled in different regions and developed more permanent lifestyles, their myths became more grounded in local experiences. A coastal people might emphasize the power of the sea. A desert people might focus on the sun or the scarcity of water. A forest people might tie meaning to trees or hidden animals. But even with these differences, traces of the older shared symbols continued appearing. The circle remained important in many cultures, perhaps due to its connection to the sun, the moon, or simple cycles of life. Animals like snakes, birds, and large predators appear in myths from every inhabited continent. And the idea of worlds above and worlds below became nearly universal, possibly rooted in the early experience of looking at the sky and imagining what lay beyond it. These shared traits suggest that early humans didn't just migrate with practical knowledge, they carried emotional knowledge as well. They passed along the feelings tied to nighttime silence, the reactions to storms or eclipses, the relief of sunrise after a dangerous night, and the curiosity of watching the stars move across the sky. Those feelings shaped their stories every bit as much as the details of the world around them. And because human emotions haven't changed much over tens of thousands of years, those feelings produced myths that still feel familiar today. If we consider the possibility that a first civilization once existed, one older than the civilizations we've documented, then its stories could have travelled far beyond the reach of its physical remains. Everything that civilization built may have vanished, but the stories and symbols could have survived through migration. They could have spread slowly across continents, carried by groups that had no memory of their true origins. By the time they reached the earliest recorded cultures, the stories might have changed so much that they seemed entirely new. Yet beneath those layers, some of the original ideas might still be present. This perspective doesn't take anything away from the richness of the world's religions. It doesn't claim that they all came from a single source, or that their differences are superficial. Instead, it highlights something more subtle. Humans everywhere have always searched for meaning using the tools available to them. Those tools often included stories, symbols, and shared experiences. If those tools had a common origin in the earliest days of human culture, then modern belief systems might share distant echoes of ideas formed long before history began. As migration continued, myths would have adapted to new technologies and social structures. The development of agriculture, for example, made seasonal cycles far more important. People needed to predict when to plant and harvest, and many myths reflect this focus. The invention of pottery allowed symbols to be preserved more reliably. Simple marks on early vessels show how symbols once carved in stone or drawn in sand became part of everyday life. These developments didn't replace older beliefs, they built on them. A symbol once tied to a star might later be used to mark time for planting. A symbol once tied to a story about an animal might later signify a social role or a moral idea. As more complex societies formed, myths gained structure. Narratives that once shifted with every retelling became more stable. People began assigning specific roles to certain figures in their stories. These figures could represent natural forces, moral lessons, or ancestral memories. With each generation, these figures became more defined and more central to a group's identity. Eventually, these structured myths became the core of early religious traditions. But before reaching that point, the myths themselves needed countless generations of travel. They had to pass through forgotten lands, across mountains, through forests, along coasts, and into valleys where new communities formed. They had to survive moments of disaster, long migrations, and changes in climate. They had to adapt to countless different ways of living. The fact that so many ancient stories survived in recognizable forms suggests how deeply humans valued these ideas. As people began to settle for longer periods of time and their groups grew into more stable communities, the stories and symbols they carried didn't fade. Instead, they started becoming part of the physical world around them. What once lived only in memory and in spoken words began appearing in places where time moved more slowly, in materials that outlasted individual lives. The earliest carvings and arrangements of stones weren't created with the intention of becoming landmarks for future generations. They were practical, familiar, and personal expressions of meaning. Yet because stone survives in ways voices never could, these expressions eventually became the first permanent traces of what early humans believed. If we imagine the people who created these early markings, they probably didn't think of themselves as artists or builders of anything significant. They were likely individuals with steady hands, patience, or a keen eye for detail. When a group recognized a pattern in the sky, or a recurring natural event that shaped their survival, someone might carve a simple shape on a rock nearby, not as a sacred act, at least not at first, but as a way to mark a memory or reinforce a shared understanding. A carved spiral might remind the community of a seasonal cycle. A set of lines might represent a path to follow. These simple marks became part of their surroundings, blending into daily life. Over time, as communities grew more confident in certain symbols, those symbols became connected to rituals. Rituals didn't appear suddenly or with formal structure. They grew slowly through repeated actions that felt comforting or meaningful. If leaving a small stone on a certain spot seemed to bring good luck, people might repeat it. If drawing a symbol before a hunt felt reassuring, it might become a habit shared by others. These small gestures could eventually turn into traditions. When enough people repeated the same actions regularly, the actions gained importance simply because they united the group through routine. The earliest rituals didn't try to explain life in any grand sense. They were grounded in practical needs and emotional responses. A group facing scarcity might perform a small ceremony to encourage unity before a challenging season. A family mourning a loved one might leave objects at a burial site to show respect or to keep the memory close. Over generations, these actions developed meaning that outlasted the original reasons behind them. The objects left at burial sites began to represent beliefs about what happened after death. Arrangements of stones began to represent boundaries or transitions. The repeated gestures of daily life slowly formed into patterns that would later become recognizable rituals. Some of the most intriguing traces from this period come from stone structures that predate writing by thousands of years. Large stones arranged in circles or lines didn't appear overnight. They were built through effort, cooperation, and planning. For people who didn't have permanent settlements or complex tools, choosing to move and position huge stones meant the task mattered deeply. These stone structures might have marked the movement of the sun or the alignment of stars. They might have signalled important seasonal changes or reminded communities when certain rituals should occur. Even if the original meanings have been lost, the effort required to create them suggests they held significance for the people who built them. Carvings on stones also began to take on more detailed forms. Some depicted animals associated with the group's survival. Others represented shapes connected to earlier symbols passed down through generations. These carvings weren't only decorative, they were part of a shared visual language that helped communities understand their place in the world. When someone added a carving to a site already filled with marks, they contributed to a growing story. Each symbol carried its own meaning, but together they created a larger picture of how the community saw itself and its environment. The development of these stone sites also shaped how people interacted with the land. A place with many carvings or arranged stones might become a regular gathering spot. People might meet there to make decisions, share news, or bring offerings. Over time, the location itself gained meaning, independent of the symbols carved into it. The land became tied to memory. A clearing where rituals took place might be associated with certain seasons. A hill with a clear view of the sky might be linked to stories about celestial patterns. The physical world and the symbolic world began blending in ways that supported each other. As symbols and rituals grew more connected, they eventually began influencing how people explained natural events. A community might attribute a successful season to the rituals they performed. They might believe that neglecting a certain gesture caused hardship. These interpretations didn't arise out of superstition in the modern sense. They developed because early humans needed ways to understand their environment and maintain social cohesion. Rituals became tools for reinforcing cooperation. When everyone took part in the same repeated actions, It strengthened the group's unity and helped maintain shared beliefs. This unity also helped ideas survive when communities split or migrated. If a group left their original settlement, they might carry a memory of a certain ritual with them. Even if they couldn't replicate the stone structures they left behind, the actions tied to those structures could continue. A ritual originally tied to a specific location might eventually take on new forms in a new region. As people adapted to different landscapes, the meanings of their rituals changed in subtle ways. A stone circle might become a fire circle. A carved symbol might become a gesture made with the hands. What mattered most wasn't the form, but the intention and the familiar repetition. The earliest rituals connected people not only to each other, but also to the memory of those who came before them. Burial sites were among the first places where communities expressed shared beliefs. When a person died, their body wasn't only left behind as a necessity. Objects were placed beside them, indicating that the group believed something continued beyond death. These objects weren't chosen randomly. They were often tools, ornaments, or symbols the person used in life. This practice suggests early humans believed the connection between the living and the dead didn't end completely. The presence of these objects reflects a desire to maintain continuity between one generation and the next. As communities developed more stable structures, rituals around death grew more elaborate. The placement of stones, the choice of objects, and the gestures made during the burial process became symbolic. These rituals weren't about fear or confusion. They were expressions of care, respect, and memory. They helped people cope with loss and maintain a sense of order during difficult moments. Over time, they may have contributed to beliefs about ancestors watching over the group or guiding them in some way. The idea of ancestors having influence didn't appear suddenly. It likely emerged slowly as people remembered stories about those who had passed. When children learned about older relatives they had never met, the stories made those individuals feel present in some way. If a group survived a challenge and remembered that an elder once spoke about a similar event, the memory might take on symbolic meaning. These small connections, repeated over generations, could form the basis for beliefs about ancestors, continuing to play roles in the lives of the living. As rituals continued to evolve, they began influencing decisions and shaping social structure. Certain individuals might become known for their ability to perform rituals in a way that felt meaningful or reassuring to others. These people weren't priests in the modern sense. They were simply individuals whose presence or knowledge made others feel more confident. Over time, they might have taken on roles that centered around guiding rituals, maintaining symbols, or preserving stories. As generations passed, these roles could become more formalized, eventually contributing to the development of early religious leadership. However, the roots of such roles remained grounded in the basic human need for understanding and stability. Rituals helped people feel connected to the world, to each other, and to their past. Symbols carved in stone allowed knowledge to survive long after the original storytellers were gone. The combination of memory, ritual, and physical expression created a framework that would later support the expansion of more structured belief systems. When we think about the spread of these early rituals, it's important to remember how much time passed during this process. Tens of thousands of years gave people ample opportunity to adapt, refine, and reinterpret their practices. Landmarks that appear ancient to us today were built generations apart from each other, separated by long periods during which communities changed shape and direction. These changes didn't erase earlier meanings. They added new layers. A ritual might begin as a practical tool for survival, then become tied to a particular symbol, and eventually take on emotional significance tied to the memory of ancestors. Each layer contributed to a richer set of beliefs. The stone structures and symbols we find today are only fragments of what once existed. Many others were lost to time or built with materials that didn't survive. But even these fragments tell us something important. Early humans cared deeply about keeping their stories alive. They invested time and effort into creating objects and structures that would outlast them. They didn't do this because someone commanded it. They did it because it felt meaningful to preserve their understanding of the world in physical form. As beliefs grew more complex, rituals began influencing how groups interacted with the environment. Certain locations became associated with specific actions. A clearing in a forest might be used for gatherings. A cave with carvings might be visited during certain seasons. A large stone placed on a hill might become a marker for directional travel. These places gained identity through repeated use. They became spaces where people expressed their shared beliefs and strengthened their social bonds. The connection between place and belief wasn't limited to a single generation. Children grew up seeing adults perform rituals in certain areas, and those places became part of their world view. When they became adults, they repeated the gestures, carrying forward the traditions without fully questioning their origins. This generational repetition allowed rituals to survive even when the original meanings had faded. A gesture that once symbolized a celestial pattern might later come to represent something else entirely. But the ritual itself persisted because it brought people together in familiar, comforting ways. If we trace these developments toward the earlier civilizations, it becomes clear how rituals and symbols laid the foundation for more organized systems. When communities began building permanent settlements, they brought their traditions with them. Symbols appeared on walls, pottery, and early writing systems. Rituals became tied to community leadership, seasonal events, and social roles. The beliefs that had once been simple interpretations of the environment became part of structured institutions. But even as civilizations formed, the echoes of earlier times remained. The stone carvings, the ritual gestures, the attention to celestial patterns. All of these elements had travelled through thousands of years of migration, adaptation, and reinterpretation. They carried the voices of the first storytellers, the hands of the first carvers, and the memories of generations whose names will never be known. As communities grew more settled and rituals became familiar parts of daily life, there came a point when certain individuals naturally began taking on roles that looked a little different from the rest. These weren't leaders in the political sense, because early societies didn't operate with clear hierarchies the way later civilizations did. But there were always people who paid closer attention, who remembered details others forgot, who explained things in ways that made sense, or who simply had the calm presence others trusted during uncertain times. Over generations, individuals like this became the first teachers, people whose influence shaped how stories were told, remembered, and understood. The concept of a teacher didn't appear suddenly or with any formality. It grew slowly through everyday interactions. A person who consistently noticed the sky's patterns might explain them to younger members of the group. Someone who remembered the right time to prepare for a difficult season could become the voice others sought when decisions needed to be made. Another person might have a steady way of guiding rituals so that the group felt reassured. These individuals didn't set out to teach. They taught because they noticed, remembered, and cared enough to share what they knew. In early human communities, knowledge was survival, remembering how to track animals, knowing where water could be found during a dry period, recognizing which plants were safe to eat. All of this required experience and memory. Someone who accumulated more of this knowledge than others naturally earned the respect of the people around them. When that knowledge included stories tied to symbols, rituals, or natural events, the role of teacher expanded beyond practical guidance. It also included shaping the stories that gave the group a sense of continuity. Imagine a group sitting by a fire preparing for a difficult winter. A respected elder might begin retelling a story about how ancestors survived a similar season long ago. The details might include a constellation that appeared bright during that time, or a ritual gesture believed to bring unity. The children would listen closely. The adults would nod, remembering how the same story had helped them in previous years. And somewhere in that moment, the storyteller wasn't just sharing a memory. They were teaching the group how to interpret the world. Over many generations, stories like these became the foundation for what eventually developed into sacred narratives. not sacred in the sense of being formal or written down, but sacred because they were trusted, repeated, and tied to experiences that shaped the identity of the group. The first teachers didn't create these stories from imagination alone. They wove together memories, practical knowledge, and symbolic interpretations. Their storytelling wasn't meant to control or persuade. It was meant to support, clarify, and strengthen the bonds that held the community together. It's fascinating to think how small changes in a story might have emerged naturally over time. One teacher might emphasize a particular detail, while another might add a part based on something they had personally experienced. These additions didn't feel like inventions. They felt like clarifications or expansions. When storytelling relies entirely on memory, each retelling is also an interpretation. A teacher passing on a story wasn't reciting something rigid. They were shaping it to fit the moment, the audience, and the current needs of the group. This process created stories that weren't fixed but were deeply meaningful. They grew slowly, absorbing new layers as the group encountered challenges or discoveries. A story originally tied to a celestial event might later include elements related to a significant migration. A tale about a dangerous animal might eventually highlight the importance of cooperation. Early teachers weren't just relaying information. They were guiding how the community understood itself, what it valued, and how it interpreted the unpredictable world around it. As time went on, some teachers became known not only for their knowledge, but for the way they communicated it. A calm communicator who could explain the shifting seasons might become the person others looked to when preparing for yearly cycles. Someone who understood the purpose behind rituals might guide how they were performed during important gatherings. These roles gradually became more defined because the community relied on them, and as communities grew larger, the need for consistent teaching became even more important. In larger groups, it was no longer possible for everyone to remember everything. Teachers served as repositories of shared knowledge. They remembered the meanings behind symbols carved into stones. They recalled the stories tied to old migration routes. They knew which rituals were meant for which times. Their memories became part of the group's identity. When children learned from them, they weren't just learning practical skills. They were learning how to belong to the community and how to see themselves as part of something older than their own lifetimes. The emergence of teachers also helped stabilize the stories that would later become foundational myths. When certain individuals became recognized as the primary storytellers, their versions of stories became more widely accepted. This didn't make the stories rigid, but it did create a sense of continuity that might have been absent when everyone contributed equally. Over time, communities might have relied on these teachers during moments of uncertainty, turning to them for reassurance or guidance. These early teachers likely had different strengths depending on their personalities and experiences. Some might have been more observant of the environment. Others might have had strong memories for the stories told by elders. Another might have had a steady presence during rituals. The variation in teaching styles meant that the stories themselves continued to evolve. A new generation of teachers might introduce interpretations shaped by their experiences, which differed from those of previous generations. And yet, even with these changes, the core elements of the stories remained because they were tied to universal human experiences. As we imagine the passage of thousands of years, teachers played a major role in turning flexible myths into recognizable traditions. They introduced consistency in interpretation, while still allowing stories to adapt. In some communities, specific individuals might have been responsible for maintaining certain rituals. Others might have been responsible for explaining celestial patterns. Eventually, some teachers might have gained reputations that extended beyond their immediate groups. When families or small communities encountered each other, stories from one teacher might blend with those from another, creating shared myths that travelled across distances. It's also possible that the earliest forms of social roles emerged around these teaching responsibilities. A group might begin referring to one person as the one who knows, even if they didn't have a distinct word for such a role. This informal recognition helped ensure that important knowledge wasn't lost when someone passed away. Teachers likely trained younger individuals by involving them in rituals, explaining symbols, and encouraging them to observe the natural world closely. Over generations, this informal training helped create a lineage of memory keepers. Memory keepers played a critical role in the preservation of early belief systems. Before writing existed, everything depended on accurate recollection and consistent teaching. If a story or ritual was forgotten, it couldn't be recovered unless there were others who remembered it. The responsibility was heavy, but it was also shared, as multiple teachers within a community ensured that knowledge was never held by a single person. This shared responsibility helped prevent power imbalances and encourage cooperation. The idea of sacred stories didn't begin with the intention of creating anything sacred. It began with the simple act of repeating what mattered. A story became sacred when it helped a group survive, when it helped them make sense of danger, when it reminded them of their history, when it guided them in moments of uncertainty. Over time, the most useful stories became the most protected. Teachers took extra care to preserve them, to teach them accurately, and to pass them on during important gatherings. When a group experienced a significant event, a storm that destroyed their settlement, a year when food was scarce, a conflict with another group, the stories told during those moments took on new weight. Teachers might weave these events into the larger narrative, connecting them to existing symbols or rituals. These additions helped the group maintain a sense of continuity. Instead of viewing each event as random or unexpected, they could place it within the framework of stories they already trusted. This process made the stories even more central to the group's identity. As myths grew more elaborate, teachers played an important role in preventing them from becoming overwhelming. They could simplify complex ideas for younger listeners. They could clarify the parts that held the deepest meaning. They could tie practical lessons to symbolic narratives so that children learned survival skills through stories rather than through instruction alone. This blending of practical and symbolic knowledge was one of the defining features of early teachers. The first teachers weren't only storytellers, they were also the ones who interpreted signs in the environment, performed the gestures tied to rituals, and explained the reasons behind each action. They created connections between symbols and lived experience. If a ritual gesture was connected to a certain season, the teacher explained why. If a symbol was carved into a stone that marked a path, the teacher described how that symbol related to the group's history. In this way, teachers shaped not only the content of sacred stories, but also how people understood the world. As communities expanded and became more complex, the role of teachers expanded as well. They began guiding when certain rituals should be performed, how gatherings should be organized, and which symbols were appropriate for important events. This wasn't done through authority or force, it was done through trust. People relied on teachers because their knowledge had proven helpful time and time again. The stability teachers provided allowed communities to plan for the future with greater confidence. This process eventually contributed to the development of early belief systems that resembled the beginnings of religion. Not because teachers set out to establish doctrines, but because their consistent explanations and interpretations formed the basis for shared understanding. When a group consistently heard the same story from the same teacher, that story became more deeply ingrained. When rituals were performed the same way every year under a teacher's guidance, they became part of the group's rhythm. Over generations, these rhythms shaped cultural identity. In time, early teachers became figures around whom traditions revolved. Their influence extended across generations, not because of formal authority, but because of the memories they preserved, the meanings they clarified, and the stability they offered. Their efforts helped turn scattered ideas into coherent narratives. They transformed symbols into lessons. They turned rituals into shared experiences. They helped communities maintain continuity during periods of change. When we look back across the enormous span of human history, it's tempting to imagine early civilizations as separate islands, each forming its own ideas without much influence from anyone else. That impression comes mostly from how we study the past today, sorting cultures into neat categories with distinct timelines and artifacts. But the reality of early humanity was far more fluid. People were constantly on the move, sharing knowledge even when they didn't intend to, blending traditions and building on ideas inherited from countless generations before them. If a very early civilization existed, one much older than the ones we often talk about, its influence could have spread far wider than its physical remains ever did. It might have seeded beliefs that later emerged in entirely different regions, carried by people who no longer remembered where the ideas began. To understand how this could happen, it helps to picture that potential first civilization not as a vast, highly structured society, but as a network of communities who shared a common language, similar rituals and recognizable symbols. They may have gathered in a central region for reasons tied to climate, resources, or geography. Perhaps they settled near rivers that flooded regularly, providing nourishment for plants and animals. Or maybe they lived along coastlines where food was plentiful and travel was relatively easy. Whatever the landscape looked like, it would have shaped their experiences and therefore their early beliefs. Even though we tend to think of civilizations as large, advanced entities, the earliest forms didn't need to be grand. A civilization can begin with nothing more than a stable community that grows more interconnected over time. People within that community share similar ways of interpreting the world. They repeat the same rituals. They pass down stories that become the foundation of how they understand life. If enough people share these traditions for long enough, the culture becomes distinct, even if it's still small in numbers. Now imagine that this early civilization, stable for a long period, suddenly faced challenges. A shift in climate, a drought that lasted too many years, a change in river patterns, a natural disaster, or simply population growth that made the area unable to support all of its people. These kinds of pressures occurred regularly in ancient times. When they did, communities often divided. Some groups stayed behind, others travelled outward, following familiar routes or exploring new ones. Those outward journeys might have lasted generations, with people settling for years in one region before moving again. As these groups moved, they carried their beliefs with them. Stories didn't stay behind. Symbols didn't stay etched into distant stones. Everything meaningful travelled in memory and language and rituals and in the habits that shaped daily life. And because the groups were moving into new environments, their original beliefs naturally began adapting to the landscapes around them. A ritual tied to a river might shift slightly if the group moved to a forested region. A symbol originally connected to a certain animal might take on a new interpretation if the animal wasn't present in the new territory. These adjustments weren't signs of losing their original beliefs. They were signs of beliefs evolving, just as language changes as people move across regions. Over many generations, these migrated groups might have transformed into entirely new cultures. They might have developed new dialects, new myths, and new versions of old stories. The children born in these new lands would grow up hearing tales not of a distant homeland, but of the environment they knew. Yet the bones of their stories, the core ideas about the sky, the earth, life, death, and unseen forces, could still reflect the worldview of that first civilization. Even if no one remembered the original names or details, the underlying structure could persist. Historians and archaeologists sometimes find striking similarities between distant cultures that seem impossible to explain through direct contact. Myths about great floods, stories of sky beings, ideas about an underworld, emphasis on certain animals, patterns that repeat across continents. One explanation is that different cultures developed similar myths independently because they responded to similar environmental triggers. That's certainly part of the story. But another explanation is that early humans shared a common pool of symbolic ideas that had travelled for thousands of years before settling in different regions. If that's true, then the first civilization didn't need to send emissaries across the world or build monumental structures in every region. Its influence could have spread through everyday migration. Families leaving their homeland for practical reasons would carry their early beliefs into entirely new territories. Generations later, Their descendants might no longer feel any connection to that ancient homeland, but the stories could continue, transformed yet still recognisable in their structure. It's also possible that as these groups moved, they encountered other communities with their own beliefs and practices. When that happened, stories blended, symbols combined, rituals merged. A group that once followed one set of ideas might adopt elements from another simply because the combination made sense in their new environment. These cultural exchanges helped spread ideas across enormous distances. Over time, it became almost impossible to distinguish which beliefs had originated where. What mattered was that the idea survived, adapted, and became part of the cultural landscape of many different regions. If we look at the earliest writing systems from ancient civilizations, Mesopotamian cuneiform, Egyptian hieroglyphs, early Chinese characters, we can see traces of much older symbolic traditions. Many of the symbols represent natural elements, celestial patterns, or animals that held importance long before writing existed. This suggests that the beliefs recorded in early texts weren't new inventions. They were written down versions of oral traditions that had existed for thousands of years. If these oral traditions came from a shared early source, then writing simply preserved what had already been carried across generations and landscapes. One of the strongest pieces of evidence supporting this idea is the persistence of certain story structures. Many cultures have creation stories that begin with darkness or emptiness. Many have stories about light emerging or order forming from chaos. Many describe a moment when the world was shaped by forces beyond human control. These similarities don't prove that every culture inherited the same story from a single source, but they do suggest that early humans shared a deep-seated need to explain the world in ways that felt reassuring, meaningful, and connected to the patterns they observed. The idea that a first civilization could seed many later beliefs also becomes more plausible when we consider how resilient stories can be. A practical piece of knowledge, like how to find water in a certain region, might be forgotten if a group moves far enough away from its origin. But a story tied to identity tends to survive. A story that explains why the stars move, or why the sun returns after winter, or why life and death follow predictable rhythms, can be retold even when the original environment no longer exists. The memory becomes symbolic rather than literal, carried because it offers structure rather than because it provides specific instructions. Imagine the earliest travellers spreading outward across climates and continents. They carry stories about the world's beginnings, about spirits connected to animals, about rituals tied to survival. Their children grow up hearing these stories in new environments, and the stories shift slightly to fit the new context. One group's story about a river might become another group's story about a mountain. A tale about a certain animal might transform into a tale about a different species with similar behaviour. The meaning survives while the details evolve. Over thousands of years, these evolving stories could branch into countless variations. By the time written records appear, the stories would seem distinct. But beneath the differences, they might share subtle similarities, patterns of narrative structure, parallel roles played by symbolic figures, or common themes about the relationship between humans and the natural world. These underlying similarities might be the distant echoes of that early civilization, preserved not in stone or metal but in the stories carried by migrating communities. Symbols played a large role in this spread of ideas. Early communities used symbols long before writing because they offered a way to preserve meaning through simple shapes. A spiral could represent cycles, a circle could represent the sun, a line might represent direction, a set of dots might mark stars or seasons. When groups migrated, they carried these symbols with them and taught them to their children. Even if the symbols changed shape over time, the idea of using symbols to represent meaning stayed intact. This practice helped keep ideas alive long after their original forms disappeared. If the first civilization used symbols to record or express meaning, those symbols could have influenced cultures far beyond its borders. A symbol carved into a rock might inspire a similar symbol used elsewhere, even if the meaning gradually changed. Over many generations, these symbols could become integrated into entirely new ceremonies and stories, contributing to the development of later religious traditions. Language also played a crucial role. When groups migrated, their language changed, words evolved, sounds shifted. But certain terms tied to important concepts, like the sky, the sun, the earth, ancestors, or cycles, might have persisted in various forms across different regions. Linguists sometimes find similarities between words in distant languages that can't easily be explained through later contact. These connections might reflect a shared linguistic ancestor that existed long before recorded history. If that early language belonged to the first civilization, then its vocabulary could have shaped how many later cultures expressed their beliefs. All of this leads to a compelling possibility. The first civilization didn't need to dominate or control others to influence them. Its ideas could have spread naturally through migration, memory, and adaptation. The stories that helped people survive became the stories that shaped their understanding of the world. And as those stories evolved in different regions, they could eventually form the foundations of the religions we know today. This perspective doesn't suggest that all religions are the same. It simply highlights the shared human tendency to create meaning from experience. When the earliest humans looked at the sky, they saw the same stars we see. When they watched seasons change, they felt the same uncertainty we feel during transitions. When they lost loved ones, they experienced grief that needed explanation and comfort. These universal experiences shaped the earliest beliefs. If one civilization lived during a time when these interpretations were beginning to form, its influence could have reached far beyond its original region. As generations continued to pass and communities settled in different environments, the stories that once connected them began taking forms that no longer resembled each other closely. This wasn't a sudden change. It happened gradually, through small adjustments, misunderstandings, new experiences, and the influence of landscapes that shaped daily life. People who once shared the same interpretations of the world eventually saw things differently, simply because they were exposed to different challenges, climates, and social structures. What had once been a shared thread began weaving into separate patterns, each one shaped by the particular needs of the group that carried it. If we imagine a group settling near a fertile valley, their rituals might grow around the predictable cycles of planting, growing, and harvesting. Stories tied to the return of a certain star cluster could become linked to agricultural tasks. A symbol once connected to survival during harsh seasons might become a symbol of abundance instead. Meanwhile, another group might settle in a region where survival depended on tracking migrating animals or preparing for unpredictable weather. Their stories would adapt to these conditions, emphasizing different lessons and different figures. Over time, the two groups would no longer recognize each other's beliefs, even though both began from the same early roots. The changing of beliefs didn't feel dramatic to the people experiencing it. For them, it was mostly a matter of adjusting to their surroundings. If a certain ritual seemed effective in helping the group work together, it continued. If a story felt less relevant in a new environment, it faded naturally. Children grew up learning the newest versions of the stories, and older versions quietly slipped away unless someone preserved them intentionally. Most people simply accepted the stories told to them, trusting those who taught them and finding comfort in the familiar patterns. These slow changes eventually created distinct traditions. A shared story about ancestors could become entirely different when told in a snowy environment compared to a tropical one. A tale about the movement of the sun could shift dramatically in meaning depending on the latitude. Even small differences in the timing of seasons could cause communities to emphasize different celestial patterns. As these differences accumulated, the emerging belief systems began reflecting the landscapes and lifestyles of the people who carried them. One of the strongest influences on how beliefs diverged was environment. A community living near rivers that flooded regularly might develop explanations focused on the balance between destruction and renewal. Their rituals could revolve around predicting or influencing the flood cycle. Another community living in mountains might emphasize ideas around endurance, resilience, and the relationship between the peaks and the sky. A group living along a coastline might develop beliefs centered on tides, storms, and winds. Each environment provided different daily experiences, and stories naturally adapted to match those experiences. Another factor that shaped divergence was social structure. As communities became larger or more complex, roles within the group changed. Some people took on leadership positions, others specialized in certain tasks. Teachers and memory keepers became more important as the need for organized knowledge increased. These roles influenced which stories were emphasized and how they were interpreted. A community with strong communal decision-making might highlight stories about cooperation. A community with more hierarchical leadership might emphasize stories about authority or lineage. Over generations, these shifts shaped the moral frameworks within the stories, eventually becoming defining features of the emerging belief systems. Contact with new groups also played a major role. When communities encountered neighbours with different practices, they sometimes blended ideas. A symbol from one group could appear in another, but with a new meaning. A ritual from one region could merge with a local tradition, forming something entirely new. These cultural exchanges happened slowly, often through trade, intermarriage, or simple observation. No one thought of these changes as blending religions. They were simply adopting ideas that felt useful or meaningful, but over long periods, even small exchanges could change the direction of a belief system. Imagine a group travelling through a region where another community has carved symbols into rock faces. They might pause to study the carvings, wondering what they mean. Even without fully understanding, they could bring fragments of what they saw back to their own community, perhaps describing them during storytelling. Those fragments might evolve into new symbols or gestures. The interpretations could diverge entirely from the original meanings, but the influence would still be there, shaping beliefs in subtle ways. Another important influence on the divergence of ancient faiths was time. The longer a group remained isolated from its original cultural relatives, the more distinct its stories became. After several generations, no one would remember the original versions clearly. People might recall only the broad themes or a handful of details. Teachers would fill in gaps based on their own experiences or interpretations. Eventually, a story might be almost unrecognizable compared to its earliest form, but it would still serve a purpose for the community that carried it, offering a framework for understanding the world. Over thousands of years, these slow divergences created belief systems that looked separate from one another, even though they could have descended from a shared early source. When we look at ancient myths today, those recorded in early writing systems or preserved through oral traditions, we often see similarities that suggest deeper connections. Different cultures might describe sky beings, earth forces, underworld realms, or cycles of death and rebirth. These shared themes might reflect universal human experiences, but they could also reflect ancient stories passed along through countless migrations long before writing existed. As early civilizations formed large settlements, their belief systems became more structured. City centres required organisation. Leaders needed ways to unify people who didn't always share the same experiences. Rituals and stories became tools for creating cohesion. New structures, temples, meeting grounds, ceremonial spaces were built to reflect and reinforce the central beliefs of each community. Over time, these structures helped codify the stories, making them more stable than they had been in smaller, more mobile groups. This stability allowed beliefs to develop into recognizable religions with specific roles, rules, and narratives. At the same time, these new civilizations existed far apart from each other. Their development was shaped by entirely different geographic, economic, and social circumstances. As a result, their stories continued to diverge. A civilization near a great river might emphasize the role of water in creation or destruction. Another near dry plains might focus on the sun, winds, or seasonal hardships. A coastal civilization might build its stories around the sea. Even if all of these civilizations inherited a distant echo of the same ancient source, their interpretations would reflect the stark differences in their daily lives. Language also played a significant role. As groups settled in different regions, their languages evolved independently. Words changed, grammar shifted, new expressions were invented. The terms used to describe rituals, celestial patterns, or moral ideas gradually diverged. A story told in one language could develop nuances that didn't exist in another. These linguistic differences eventually made mutual understanding difficult, further fragmenting the stories. When belief systems were eventually written down, the written versions preserved only one of many variations. The version chosen might have depended on the preferences of leaders, the abilities of scribes, or the social values of the time. Once written, stories became more fixed. But by the time writing developed, the stories had already diverged for thousands of years. The written forms captured the state of the traditions at a moment in time, preserving differences that had long since taken root. It's also important to consider the emotional and psychological forces that influence these divergent paths. People didn't only adapt stories to reflect their environments, they adapted stories to reflect their fears, hopes, losses, and desires. A community facing frequent hardship might create stories emphasizing resilience or divine protection. A group experiencing long periods of stability might create stories emphasizing order and continuity. Shared emotional experiences shaped myths just as strongly as landscapes or social structures. These emotional influences helped determine which aspects of a tradition were preserved and which were forgotten. A story that offered comfort during difficult times might survive even when other stories faded. A ritual that created a sense of unity might continue even after its original meaning was forgotten. As different communities faced different emotional landscapes, their stories diverged accordingly. Trade networks also contributed to the divergence of ancient faiths. Once early civilizations began exchanging goods over long distances, they also exchanged ideas. Merchants and travelers carried fragments of stories with them. When they returned home, they might share unusual practices or intriguing symbols they saw elsewhere. Sometimes these fragments blended into existing beliefs, altering their direction. Other times they remained separate curiosities. Over long periods, these interactions created belief systems filled with layers from many sources. This blending was never an organized process. It happened naturally as people interacted with new ideas and adapted them to their needs. A symbol that represented one concept in one region might represent something entirely different in another. Over time, both regions might develop distinct stories built around the same basic shape. When archaeologists discover similar symbols in distant regions today, it can be difficult to determine whether they reflect direct contact or shared ancient origins. In many cases, it might be both. Layers of influence stretching across thousands of years often overlap in ways that can't be disentangled. Another factor that contributed to the divergence of ancient beliefs was the growth of competing interpretations within a single community. As populations expanded, different groups within the same settlement might emphasize different parts of the shared stories. Some teachers might focus on celestial patterns, others might emphasize moral lessons, others might highlight the importance of certain rituals. Over time, these internal differences could lead to separate traditions even within the same civilization. When communities later split or migrated, each group might carry a different version of the stories with them. Such internal divergence explains why many ancient belief systems contain conflicting elements. Instead of being signs of inconsistency, these contradictions reflect the layered history of stories that evolved over long periods. Different branches of a tradition might represent older or newer influences shaped by specific conditions in each group's past. When communities later refined their beliefs into more structured systems, they sometimes kept these multiple layers intact, preserving the complexity of their traditions. Power dynamics within emerging civilizations also influence divergence. Leaders might highlight certain stories that supported their authority. Teachers might adapt stories to reflect the values they believed were important. Rituals that strengthened the stability of the community might be emphasized over those that felt less relevant. These selective influences shaped the direction of belief systems over generations. Even small adjustments made for practical reasons could lead to significant differences in how stories developed. As these changes accumulated, the world began filling with distinct ancient religions. Each one reflected a combination of inherited ideas, environmental influences, emotional needs, social structures, and countless small adjustments made over centuries. They were different, not because humanity had separate origins, but because people followed separate paths shaped by their surroundings. But despite all of these differences, traces of shared origins sometimes remained. Similar story structures, familiar symbols, parallel rituals, repeated themes. These similarities suggest that the earliest humans shared a common foundation before spreading out across the world. Even if each belief system developed its own direction, many of them still carry echoes of something older. As different communities began forming their own traditions, the world did not become a patchwork of isolated beliefs sealed off from each other. Human beings have always been mobile, even long before the invention of roads, writing, or organized trade. Hunters followed migrating animals. Gatherers followed seasonal plants. Families followed rivers as they shifted over time. Groups moved to avoid drought, to escape conflict, or simply because they were curious about what lay beyond the horizon. Every journey created opportunities for ideas to travel, not just objects. And as people walked from place to place, they carried their beliefs with them in ways that were subtle, but incredibly persistent. When we think about travellers from ancient times, we might picture long journeys across deserts or mountains. But most early travel happened in much smaller steps. A family might move to a valley a day's walk from their old settlement. A group might stop near a river, stay for a season, then move farther. These short distances add up over generations. A story told at one fire might be told at another far away a century later. A symbol carved into a stone near one camp might appear carved into wood miles away by someone who remembered its meaning, but changed it slightly to match new surroundings. Because people travelled in small groups, they carried their beliefs in personal ways. A trader travelling between settlements might share a story while exchanging goods. A wanderer who joined a group temporarily might talk about a ritual they had learned elsewhere. Even a simple gesture could transfer meaning. If someone touched their forehead before entering a new place, others might ask why. The explanation could be simple, perhaps tied to respect or safety. That explanation could become a small seed that grew into a ritual in a community far from where it began. In many early societies, travellers weren't strangers. They were newsbringers. They provided glimpses into other ways of living. They offered stories from places no one else had seen. These travellers sometimes came from settlements that had diverged from the original shared traditions generations earlier. When they arrived, they might tell stories with familiar shapes but different details. Listeners might recognise a pattern, but hear it told in a new way. These encounters created moments of reflection and exchange. A group might adopt a version of a tale because it felt comforting, or because it explained something their own stories didn't address. Over time, these exchanges created layers of belief. A community might follow its own traditions, but also borrow ideas from travellers they respected. These borrowed ideas didn't replace local beliefs, they blended with them. A local symbol might become associated with a new story. A ritual performed during one season might shift slightly after hearing about practices from elsewhere. These small changes, repeated many times across centuries, created networks of meaning that stretched far beyond the original homeland of the earlier storytellers. Trade was one of the strongest forces behind the spread of beliefs. Even before organised marketplaces existed, people traded goods across short distances. A hunter might exchange fur for dried fruit. A farmer might trade surplus grain for pottery. Along with these goods came conversations. Traders often returned to the same places repeatedly, forming relationships with people in different regions. These relationships created trust, and where trust existed, stories flowed more easily. Imagine a trader arriving in a small settlement after a long journey. People gather round to hear news from the places he visited. He tells them how another group prepared for a difficult season, or describes a ritual he witnessed during a gathering near a distant river. He mentions symbols carved into stones he passed along the route. The people listening might be curious, they might ask questions, they might share their own rituals in return. These interactions didn't feel like exchanges of religion. They felt like exchanges of experience. But within those experiences were the seeds of countless beliefs. Travellers also played a role in connecting the meaning behind symbols. A bird symbol that represented guidance in one region might represent freedom in another. When a traveller moved between these regions, they carried associations with them. If someone asked what the bird symbol meant, the traveller might explain it according to their own tradition. The listener might find the explanation appealing and adapt it into their own stories. Over time, these exchanges created symbols with multiple interpretations, each one layered with influences from different places. Wanderers, people who didn't belong to any single group for long, were another source of spreading beliefs. These individuals might have left their home groups voluntarily or been forced out because of conflict or scarcity. Some might have chosen a nomadic life because it offered freedom from the expectations of settled communities. As they travelled, they encountered people from many regions. They listened to stories, learned rituals, and collected symbols like memories. When they moved on, they carried these memories with them, sharing them with new groups. These wanderers didn't think of themselves as carriers of spiritual ideas. They were simply telling stories or explaining familiar habits. But the communities they visited sometimes interpreted these stories with a sense of novelty or wonder. If a wanderer described a ritual performed in a distant region, listeners might repeat it because it felt meaningful. The new ritual might blend with local practices, forming something unique that didn't exist anywhere else. As wanderers continued their journeys, they carried these blended ideas even farther. Some early groups developed loose networks of movement along natural routes. Rivers served as highways, valleys created natural paths, coastlines encouraged exploration. Even without written maps, people learned the landscapes over generations. These networks allowed stories to move more efficiently. A ritual performed near one river might eventually appear thousands of miles away along the same waterway, carried by many generations of travellers who never met each other. These paths created the earliest forms of cultural continuity across vast regions. One of the most interesting aspects of this spread is how beliefs could travel farther than the people who originally created them. A small community might live quietly for centuries, never expanding beyond its valley. But if even a few of its people travelled outward, carrying stories, symbols, or rituals, those ideas might reach distant places where they evolved into something entirely new. The community itself might vanish due to environmental changes or migration. Its physical structures might disappear without a trace, yet the ideas it created might survive, woven into the beliefs of cultures far from where they originated. This phenomenon helps explain why some myths appear in regions with no direct historical contact. The people telling the stories might have been separated for thousands of years, but long before they settled in their final locations, their ancestors could have shared a cultural connection rooted in an ancient civilization. The original stories, carried by countless travellers and adapted along the way, might have diverged so much that they became almost unrecognisable. Yet certain patterns remained, like old threads woven into a new fabric. Trade expanded significantly as early civilizations developed specialized roles. Agricultural communities began producing more food than they needed, allowing some people to specialize in pottery, textiles, or metalwork. These goods became valuable items for trade, attracting travelers from far away. Along with goods came stories about the gods associated with certain tasks. A potter might describe a spirit believed to protect their craft. A metalworker might speak of a figure tied to heat and transformation. These stories could influence another community's interpretation of their own craft-related rituals, creating parallels between beliefs in different regions. In some areas, trade hubs formed naturally where different routes intersected. These places became melting pots of ideas. People from different regions gathered, exchanged goods, and shared stories. A symbol from one culture might be recognized by someone from another and interpreted differently. These meeting points encouraged new combinations of beliefs. Over time, these hubs became fertile ground for the development of elaborate traditions that blended influences from many sources. Travellers also played an important role in the spread of celestial interpretations. As people moved across different latitudes, the sky looked different. Some constellations rose higher or lower. Some stars appeared brighter or dimmer. The movement of the sun changed in subtle ways. A traveller from one region might describe a star pattern that appeared important in their homeland, prompting curiosity in people who had never noticed it. Over time, these celestial stories blended into new myths that incorporated both local and foreign elements. Consider a traveller arriving in a region where people paid attention to the moon cycles. He might tell them about a celestial alignment that marked a season in his own homeland. The local group might notice a similar pattern in their own sky and adopt the idea, creating a hybrid understanding of celestial cycles. Over generations, this hybrid idea could evolve into a new belief system that reflected both influences. These small exchanges helped unify celestial interpretations across enormous distances, even as specific details diverged. Some travellers encountered environments that felt profoundly different from those they knew. A person who grew up in a warm, fertile valley might be astonished by the sight of snow-covered mountains. A person who grew up near forests might feel uneasy in wide-open plains. These experiences often influenced how they interpreted existing stories. When they shared these interpretations with others, new symbolic associations formed. A mountain might become associated with endurance. A plain might become associated with vulnerability. These associations, once shared, could spread far beyond the original journey. Stories carried by travellers often took on new life when retold by people who had never visited the places described. A group living in a desert might hear about lush forests and imagine them as sacred spaces. A group living in a cold climate might hear about tropical storms and interpret them as acts of powerful forces. These imaginative interpretations shaped stories in ways that blended reality with emotion. Over time, these interpretations became part of local myths, influencing rituals and beliefs, even if the original descriptions were inaccurate or incomplete. The spread of ideas through travel was not always intentional. Sometimes a traveller might mention something casually, never imagining it would influence an entire community's beliefs. A simple comment about a ritual seen elsewhere might stick with someone who heard it. That person might repeat it later in a moment of need. The gesture might feel meaningful and become part of local practice. This process of unplanned influence was one of the most powerful forces shaping the ancient spiritual landscape. As communities grew into early civilizations, the movements of travellers became more structured. Trade routes formed across deserts, along rivers, through mountain passes and across seas. Merchants travelled regularly, bringing goods and ideas to distant regions. Along these routes, myths travelled too. Each stop along the route became a place where stories were shared, adapted and passed along again. Over time, the routes themselves became channels for spreading beliefs, shaping the spiritual development of entire continents. Travellers also helped spread beliefs during moments of crisis. When droughts, wars, or disasters forced groups to move unexpectedly, they carried their most important stories with them. These stories helped them maintain identity during uncertain times. When they arrived in new regions, they shared their stories with the people they met. These crisis-driven migrations often accelerated the spread of beliefs, introducing new ideas to places where they might not have appeared otherwise. Wanderers sometimes played unexpected roles in preserving older stories. A community might abandon a tradition accidentally as it adapted to a new environment. But a wanderer who remembered a fragment of that tradition from childhood might share it years later with a new group. That fragment could reconnect people to ideas that had otherwise been lost. These small moments of preservation helped keep ancient threads alive across vast expanses of time. When we look at the complexity of ancient faiths today, it becomes clear that no tradition developed in isolation. Travellers, traders, and wanderers helped create connections between cultures that might otherwise have drifted entirely apart. They carried not just goods, but pieces of stories, symbols, emotional associations, and rituals. As these elements moved across landscapes, they adapted, blended, and grew into the many belief systems we see throughout history. As stories continued to move from place to place through travellers, traders, and wanderers, something deeper began happening within the people who carried them. The worlds formed out of memory and imagination slowly blended into something far more enduring than any single ritual or symbol. The beliefs that had once been shaped mostly by experience started gaining meanings connected to emotion, reflection, and the natural tendency to wonder about things that couldn't be fully understood. The divine, in its earliest forms, wasn't introduced to people through dramatic revelations or sudden insights. It emerged from the soft spaces in human thought, where memory held onto important moments and imagination filled in the gaps that experience alone couldn't explain. If we picture early humans sitting together at night, sharing stories that had passed through countless generations, it becomes easier to see how memory shaped those stories. Every storyteller added something fresh, not because they wanted to change the narrative, but because memory itself is fluid. When someone recalls an event or a lesson, their version is shaped by how they felt at the time, by what happened afterward, and by the way they have heard others describe it. Over many retellings, these slight changes accumulate. The story grows richer, more layered, and more personal. People repeat the parts they find meaningful. They forget the parts that feel less important. And in this gradual shaping, the divine takes on form, not as a defined figure or concept, but as a feeling that something larger than the visible world might exist. This feeling didn't require complex theology. It didn't require structured belief systems. It came from noticing patterns and wanting those patterns to mean something. If a certain ritual seemed to help during a difficult time, people remembered that moment. They repeated the ritual not to manipulate forces beyond their control, but to recreate the sense of stability the action had once given them. Those small emotional anchors became part of memory, passed from one generation to the next as gentle impressions rather than strict rules. As the memories circulated, the rituals gained weight, eventually shaping how communities understood themselves and the world around them. Imagination worked alongside memory, filling in the spaces where experience didn't provide clear answers. When people encountered moments that felt larger than life, storms that arrived without warning, nights when the sky appeared brighter than usual, dreams vivid enough to feel like another reality, the imagination stepped in to provide meaning. These interpretations might not have been literal, but they reflected genuine attempts to understand the world. Imagination helped people navigate uncertainty. It made the unpredictable feel familiar, and it allowed individuals to believe that their experiences connected to something beyond their immediate understanding. This blending of memory and imagination created the first embers of what later became divine concepts. Not divine figures with names or personalities, but a sense that the universe held unseen layers. When someone dreamed of an ancestor offering guidance, the emotional impact of the dream lingered. Even if the dream came from memory, the imagination could shape it into something meaningful. When children heard these stories, they didn't question whether they were literal. They accepted them as part of the world they were learning to navigate. And so the earliest ideas of divine connection might have begun not with the intention to form religion, but with the instinct to shape experience into something that made life feel more understandable. One of the reasons these early divine impressions endured was the power of shared storytelling. When groups gathered to hear the same story repeated many times, the narrative began to feel stable, even if it changed slightly each time it was told. Repetition gave stories authority. A tale told once might be forgotten. A tale told many times became familiar enough to feel true. And when the story offered guidance or comfort, people carried it with them, teaching it to their children as something valuable. Over time, these repeatedly told stories gained a kind of emotional truth that didn't depend on literal accuracy. The divine, in its earliest forms, might have lived in the shared belief that these stories contained wisdom worth remembering. The imagination also played a key role in how people interpreted symbols. A single shape carved into stone might represent many different ideas depending on who viewed it. When someone looked at a symbol and remembered a story tied to it, their mind naturally filled in details based on their emotions, experiences, and expectations. Another person might focus on a different part of the story. These personal interpretations helped symbols adapt to new contexts without losing their connection to older traditions. They allowed beliefs to evolve without requiring any formal structure. Over generations, this flexibility helped symbols survive even as the stories around them changed. Memory influenced how people interpreted natural events that seemed significant. When a powerful storm or eclipse happened, the event left a deep impression. People remembered where they were, how they felt, and what the community did afterward. These memories became stories. When the event repeated generations later, the story resurfaced. People imagined connections between the two occurrences. They created explanations that helped them feel less uncertain about forces beyond their control. Over time, these explanations gained depth, becoming part of the shared understanding that shaped early beliefs. Imagination helped people interpret the unseen parts of life, things like death, dreams, and emotions that couldn't be easily explained. When someone passed away, the memory of their presence lingered in the minds of those who knew them. Their voice, their habits, their gestures didn't disappear all at once. They lived on in memory, influencing daily life even after they were gone. This lingering presence made imagination a natural tool for explaining what happened after death. If a loved one appeared in a dream, the experience felt powerful. People imagined that the dream might be a message or a sign of continued existence. These interpretations helped ease grief and maintain a sense of connection between generations. Dreams played an enormous role in shaping early beliefs. Without scientific explanations for how dreams formed, people simply took them as experiences similar to waking life, except with a different quality. A dream where someone encountered an ancestor or a powerful figure didn't feel imaginary. It felt like an encounter with something real but intangible. These experiences could shape rituals, inspire new stories, or reinforce existing ones. Dreams gave imagination a place to work, creating a bridge between memory and belief. This blending of memory, imagination, and emotional experience helped early communities create frameworks that later became foundational to religious thinking, not in the sense of doctrines or commandments, but in the sense of understanding that something larger than the visible world might exist, and that human experience connected to it in meaningful ways. People didn't need grand explanations, they just needed patterns that helped them navigate life's uncertainties. These early frameworks didn't spread through force or formal teaching. They spread through quiet moments, stories told at night, dreams remembered in the morning, rituals performed out of habit and emotional association. When someone travelled to a new place, these internal frameworks travelled with them. When they shared stories or described their dreams, they influenced how others interpreted their own experiences. These subtle influences allowed divine ideas to travel across landscapes without requiring any physical representation. Imagination also helped shape the earliest concepts of moral guidance. When people faced difficult choices, whether to share food, protect a stranger, or respond to conflict, the stories they heard offered examples of how others had navigated similar situations. These examples didn't need to be literal accounts. Their power came from how they made people feel. A story about cooperation might encourage someone to help their neighbour. A story about a harmful action might create caution. Over time, these emotional lessons became part of the group's shared sense of right and wrong. The divine wasn't separate from daily life. It was woven into the choices people made, influenced by stories that blended memory and imagination. Even fear played a role in shaping divine concepts. When people encountered dangers they couldn't control, harsh storms, illness, or unexpected loss, they often turned to memory for reassurance. They recalled stories of how others survived similar challenges. If those stories included references to unseen forces offering comfort or protection, the imagination filled in the details. These ideas slowly evolved into beliefs about forces that watched over the community. Not rigid deities with defined identities, but gentle impressions of something beyond human experience that offered reassurance in difficult times. As time passed, these impressions deepened. Communities began performing rituals that honoured the unseen or expressed gratitude for survival. These rituals didn't need complex explanations. Their significance came from how they made people feel connected to each other and to the world around them. When a ritual repeatedly brought comfort, stability, or hope, people naturally associated it with something divine. The divine, in this early sense, was not a specific being. It was the feeling created by memory, imagination, and the shared experience of group rituals. As these early impressions travelled through migration, they blended with new experiences. A group moving into a different landscape might encounter unfamiliar animals, weather patterns, or celestial views. The imagination adapted old stories to these new realities. A story originally tied to a certain constellation might shift to match the stars visible in the new region. A symbol inspired by a specific animal might gain new meaning when adapted to a species found in the new environment. These shifts didn't erase the divine impressions, they broadened them, allowing them to travel far beyond their origins. In some groups, individuals with strong memories or vivid imaginations might have become known as people who understood the unseen more clearly than others. These individuals weren't priests or prophets. They were simply people whose experiences resonated strongly within their communities. When they spoke, others listened. Not because they held authority, but because their insights made sense. Over time, these individuals helped shape the direction of beliefs, reinforcing certain narratives and introducing new interpretations that felt meaningful. The power of imagination in shaping divine impressions becomes even clearer when considering how early humans explained unusual natural events. When a strange sound echoed through a valley, people imagined its source. When lightning struck in a surprising pattern, they imagined why. When they observed an eclipse, imagination filled the space between fear and understanding. These interpretations weren't attempts to create elaborate belief systems. They were natural responses to experiences that felt significant. Memory helped preserve the interpretations that brought comfort or clarity. If a story about an unusual event helped someone understand their fear, they remembered it. They repeated it. Over generations, these interpretations formed the early outlines of what would later evolve into complex divine narratives. This entire process was slow and subtle, shaped by countless small moments rather than single turning points. The embers of the divine glowed gently in the background of early human life, gaining strength as stories, rituals, and experiences accumulated. People didn't define the divine. They sensed it through the stories that shaped their emotions, the dreams that lingered in their minds, and the rituals that formed the rhythm of their days. As we follow these stories across landscapes and generations, the idea naturally arises that many of our earliest myths might share deeper roots than we usually imagine, not because a single story was carried intact across continents, but because people who once lived close together eventually drifted apart, taking fragments of shared memory with them. When these fragments settled in new regions, they grew into different forms, shaped by new experiences and new environments. The result is a world full of diverse myths that still echo familiar patterns. And if all of these stories trace back to a distant, common beginning, it raises a quiet question about what that connection means for us now. To understand how a shared root could influence the world today, it helps to picture how early stories operated when they first formed. They weren't meant to explain everything. They weren't created as systems or frameworks. They were simply ways for people to make sense of their lives. A child asked why the seasons changed, and a parent told them a story based on memories passed down through generations. An elder explained the meaning behind a certain ritual, drawing from experiences their ancestors had believed were important. Over time, these explanations became the foundation for meaning itself. If these foundations came from a shared place long ago, then beneath all the differences in myths today, there might be a faint sense of familiarity. A reminder that humans everywhere once relied on similar ways of interpreting the world. That shared interpretation came from the experiences common to all early communities. Everyone saw the sky. Everyone watched the sun rise and set. Everyone noticed the cycles of the moon. Everyone struggled through seasons of abundance and seasons of scarcity. Everyone felt emotions that didn't always make sense. And everyone wanted to connect their lives to something larger, something that made their joys and losses feel part of a bigger pattern. These universal experiences shaped early myths, which then adapted as groups migrated. Even as stories diverged, the emotional roots remained. They carried the same human need to understand, to reassess, to find comfort, and to feel connected. If all myths share a single root, even loosely, then it means the human desire to ask big questions has also been shared from the beginning. Early humans didn't develop the instinct to wonder about existence because of specific teachings or doctrines. They wondered because they were human. The myths built from that instinct weren't just stories. They were reflections of how people understood themselves. They helped individuals find meaning in events they couldn't fully explain. When we see similar themes appear in cultures separated by thousands of miles, it might not be coincidence. It might be a reminder that the earliest communities were shaped by the same emotional currents that still shape us today. The idea of a shared root doesn't diminish the uniqueness of different traditions. In many ways, it makes them more remarkable. Each tradition preserved its own perspective, language, symbols, and lessons. Yet beneath these differences, many traditions respond to the same human questions. Ideas about life after death, cycles of creation and destruction, moral behaviour, the balance of forces in the world, the importance of remembering ancestors, and the presence of unseen or spiritual influences appear in countless forms. These shared themes might have evolved independently, but they might also reflect the influence of a distant tradition that slowly branched into many shapes. When we look at the myths that developed in completely different environments, rainforests, deserts, mountains, savannas, the similarities become especially interesting. Stories about floods, for example, appear in many cultures. Some describe floods caused by the anger of spirits. Others describe floods as part of a cycle. Others depict floods as cleansing forces or transformative events. These similarities might indicate that early humans lived in regions where floods were common enough to shape memory. As communities moved away from those regions, they carried the memory of the flood with them, even if their new homes didn't experience such events. Over generations, the memory turned into metaphor, symbol, and myth. Symbols also reveal this shared connection. Spirals, circles, and lines appear in rock carvings, pottery, and art from distant cultures. These shapes might have been easy to draw, but the meanings they carried often transcended simple decoration. A circle might represent cycles. A spiral might represent growth or continuity. A straight line might represent direction or boundaries. If these symbols were used in early communities before they dispersed, then the symbols themselves became carriers of shared memory. Even when the meanings evolved, the basic shapes stayed familiar enough to feel significant. Thinking about these connections leads to questions not only about the past, but also about the present. If myths share a single root, what does that suggest about the stories we tell today? Modern narratives, whether scientific, spiritual, or personal, still attempt to make sense of the same mysteries that early humans faced. We still look at the sky with curiosity. We still search for meaning in dreams, coincidences, and emotional experiences. We still build rituals, even if they look different from those practiced thousands of years ago. Even something simple like lighting a candle, taking a deep breath before a difficult conversation, or marking the passage of time with celebrations might reflect patterns that have existed since the earliest communities. If these patterns come from a shared root, then they tell us something about the continuity of human experience. No matter how far apart cultures have travelled, people have always tried to understand where they came from, where they are going, and how they fit within the world. The diversity of myths might show how adaptable humans are, but the underlying similarities might show how deeply connected we are. We are shaped by different landscapes, languages, and histories, but our need to create meaning links us across time and distance. This connection isn't a claim that all myths are the same, or that they can be reduced to a single explanation. Instead, it suggests that people have always been part of a long story, one that began before writing existed and before people settled into distinct civilizations. When communities separated and developed their own traditions, they carried the threads of that story with them. Some threads became central parts of new beliefs, others faded or transformed, but the core influences remained, even when they became unrecognizable. Understanding this shared root can also influence how we think about the origins of religious identity. People often associate themselves with specific traditions that feel unique and meaningful. These traditions become part of personal and cultural identity. They shape how families teach values, how communities celebrate events, and how individuals reflect on their place in the world. If these traditions descend from a shared root, then identity becomes both individual and collective at the same time. It becomes a reminder that the tradition a person follows today might contain distant echoes of experiences shared by people they will never meet, from places they will never visit. This perspective can also change how we understand differences between belief systems. Instead of viewing differences as signs of separation, we might see them as signs of growth. A plant with many branches doesn't lose connection to its root. The branches grow in different directions, shaped by sunlight, wind, and soil. In the same way, myths grew and adapted based on the environments and experiences of different communities. The differences show how people responded to their lives, not how they drifted from a single truth. The shared root remains beneath the surface, even if the branches appear far apart. Reflecting on this shared root might also influence how we interpret the stories we tell about ourselves today. Myths were never meant to be historical records. They were meaningful interpretations of experience. In many ways, we still create myths, whether we call them myths or not. When people explain their lives through narratives about growth, struggle, discovery, or transformation, they follow patterns that have existed for thousands of years. When we speak about purpose or meaning, we use language shaped by generations of stories. This doesn't make modern interpretations less valid. It makes them part of a long tradition of using stories to navigate life. If myths share a common root, then it also means that humanity has been asking the same questions since the beginning. What happens after death? Why do certain patterns repeat? Is there purpose behind events? Or do we create purpose by telling stories about them? These questions shaped early rituals and continue to shape modern thought. Even people who don't consider themselves spiritual often reflect on meaning, connection, and the passage of time in ways that resemble the contemplations of early humans. The shared root doesn't erase differences, it highlights continuity, a thread running through generations that links ancient fireside conversations with the quiet reflections people have today. This continuity might also help explain why certain myths feel strangely familiar even when they come from cultures far removed from our own. When someone hears a story about transformation, rebirth, or a journey into the unknown, something in the story feels recognizable. The pattern fits into a place in the mind that has been shaped by countless narratives from childhood onward. This familiarity might come not from direct exposure to the specific story, but from exposure to long-standing patterns that trace back to early human experience. The details change, but the emotional structure remains. Thinking about a shared root also encourages a sense of humility. No matter how complex civilizations have become, they still rely on meaning-making systems developed long before writing, formal education, or scientific knowledge. Humans today use advanced tools to explore the universe, but the desire that drives exploration remains the same as the curiosity that led early humans to watch the stars each night. The questions aren't new. The scales and tools have changed, but the underlying wonder remains. If all myths share a single root, even if that root is fragmented and hidden beneath layers of cultural change, it suggests that humanity's story is interconnected. Not in a literal sense where all beliefs merge into one, but in a deeper sense where all beliefs reflect variations of shared human experiences. These experiences have always shaped how people make sense of the world. They have always guided the imagination. They have always influenced memory. And they have always contributed to the development of meaning and identity. As we reach this point in the journey, the landscape of ancient stories stretches out behind us like a trail shaped by countless footsteps. Every idea, every symbol, every hint of meaning feels connected to something older, something carried far across time by people who may not have known what they were preserving. The stories that guide us now, whether held in books, held in rituals, or simply held in memory, didn't appear out of nowhere. They grew slowly, shaped by groups who wanted to understand the world and their place in it. When we begin asking where those stories truly started, we're not searching for a single moment or a single civilization. We're exploring the quiet space where human curiosity first began to settle into patterns that could be shared, remembered, and passed along. It's easy to imagine that the stories we know today began fully formed, but the earliest moments were likely simple. A person noticing something that felt meaningful, a small group gathering to reflect on something unusual that happened during the day, someone wondering aloud why the sky changes colours at dusk. These moments didn't feel like the origins of grand myths. They felt like ordinary conversations about the world. But slowly, over generations, ordinary conversations layered themselves into traditions. These traditions turned into the outlines of stories, and as those outlines were retold, they became the earliest versions of myths. Every community that existed before writing had stories they believed were ancient. But those stories didn't stay fixed. The same narrative told by the same person might sound slightly different each time. The changes weren't intentional. They were shaped by memory, emotion, and the needs of the moment. If the community faced a difficult season, the storyteller might lean into the parts of the story that offered comfort. If the group had recently travelled to a new region, the storyteller might adjust the details to reflect the unfamiliar landscape. These small adjustments didn't weaken the story. They allowed it to survive by adapting to whatever life demanded at the time. As these stories travelled across regions, carried by families moving from one settlement to another, they began diverging into countless variations. But even as the variations took on new shapes, they still carried the faint structure of the earliest versions. The core ideas remained recognisable even after the details shifted. When people wondered where they came from or how the world began, the earliest memories and interpretations shaped their answers. These answers didn't need to be perfectly consistent. They only needed to resonate enough to be repeated. And in that repetition, the stories rooted themselves into the identity of each community. Asking where our stories begin invites us to consider not only their content, but also the forces that shape them. The first force was curiosity. Even without tools, maps, or long histories to draw from, early humans looked at the world with questions that feel familiar to us now. They wondered why the seasons changed, why the stars moved in patterns, why life was unpredictable, and why loss felt so significant. These questions didn't come from knowledge but from observation. Curiosity created the space for stories to form, and memory helped those stories survive. Another force was emotion. Early stories weren't just attempts to explain the world. They were attempts to understand personal experiences. Fear, gratitude, joy, confusion and grief all played roles in shaping how stories evolved. When a story helped someone make sense of something difficult, they remembered it. When a ritual created a feeling of unity during a stressful moment, the ritual continued. These emotional anchors kept stories alive long after the practical details had faded. Over generations, the emotional parts of a story became just as important as the narrative itself. Imagination was a quiet force in these early developments. When real events lacked clear explanations, imagination filled the spaces in between. People didn't create fiction for entertainment the way we think of it today. They created interpretations. When a dream felt significant, imagination helped people find meaning in it. When a natural event seemed too powerful or unexpected, imagination offered possibilities that made the experience feel less random. These imaginings shaped the earliest versions of divine concepts, not through doctrine or structure, but through the natural human impulse to find meaning where direct understanding wasn't possible. As stories took shape, they didn't just speak about the world, they also spoke about identity. Early humans lived in small groups where relationships were essential for survival. The stories they created helped define what those relationships meant. They taught people how to treat one another, what to value, and how to behave during difficult moments. These values weren't imposed from outside, they emerged organically as communities tried to maintain harmony. Over time, stories became carriers of moral understanding. They didn't need precise instructions. The lessons were woven into narratives about ancestors, journeys, or natural cycles. If all of these stories, diverse as they are today, might once have shared a distant root, then that root wasn't a fully formed religion or a defined belief system. It was a set of emotional, psychological, and practical responses to the world that almost every early human experienced. These responses shaped the first stories, and those stories became the seeds for the myths that grew later. When communities separated over time, each group shaped the seeds differently. What survived in one region might have faded in another. What became central in one culture might have remained a small detail in another, but the underlying human impulse to ask questions remained the same everywhere. Thinking about a shared beginning also highlights the importance of connection. Even if the earliest communities drifted far apart, they carried echoes of each other's stories. Those echoes appear today in the parallels between myths, symbols, and rituals from cultures with no direct contact. They appear in the idea of creation emerging from a state of chaos or darkness. They appear in the idea of forces beyond the visible world shaping events. They appear in symbols tied to cycles, rebirth, transformation, and journeys. These parallels might have evolved independently, but they might also reflect the oldest shared experiences that shaped how people interpreted the world. The quiet wonder of asking where our stories begin is not about finding a single answer. It's about understanding that the earliest humans lived with the same emotional landscape we live with now. They felt uncertainty about the future. They loved the people around them. They faced loss and didn't know what happened afterward. They saw beauty and wanted it to mean something. They looked at the sky and felt small but connected at the same time. These experiences shaped their first attempts to understand life. In many ways, those attempts continue in us today. When people from different cultures gather, even now, they often find common ground in experiences rather than language or tradition. A story about a journey resonates, regardless of where it originated. A story about transformation resonates. A story about family resonates. A story about enduring hardship resonates. These responses are not new. They reflect the shared emotional foundation that existed long before written myths, before civilizations, and before the traditions we know today. Asking where our stories begin also encourages us to think about how we create meaning now. We may not sit around fires telling stories in the same way, but we still interpret our lives through narrative. We reflect on events, assign significance to moments, and imagine possibilities for the future. When something unexpected happens, we try to understand it by linking it to experiences we've already had. We shape our identities using stories about who we were and who we want to become. These are the same processes that shaped early myths. The tools have changed, but the instincts haven't. If myths share a single distant root, then it also means that the story of humanity didn't begin with division. It began with togetherness, small groups relying on one another, sharing knowledge, and preserving meaning. Even when groups separated and developed unique traditions, the emotional foundation stayed the same. The diversity of beliefs today reflects the adaptability of stories, not the fragmentation of the human spirit. Beneath all the differences, there remains a quiet continuity. That continuity is most evident in the questions people still ask. Where do we come from? What does our life mean? Why do we feel connected to things we can't see or explain? What happens after we're gone? These questions shaped the earliest myths. They shaped the stories that travelled with the earliest migrations. They shaped the rituals that became important enough to preserve. And they continue shaping our lives now, even if we express them through different languages, different traditions, or different worldviews. The quiet wonder of asking where stories begin lies in recognizing that the past is not as distant as it sometimes feels. Even though the earlier storytellers lived in environments we can barely imagine, the rhythms of their thoughts weren't so different from ours. They found meaning in familiar patterns. They created explanations based on experience. They preserved ideas that offered comfort. And they passed these ideas down not through obligation but through genuine care for the people who would come after them. As we reflect on all of this, the journey doesn't feel like a search for definitive origins. It feels like a gentle reminder that human meaning-making is both ancient and ongoing. The stories we tell now might be newer in content, but they follow the same currents that shape the earlier stories. They help us connect with one another. They help us navigate uncertainty. They help us remember what matters. They help us imagine possibilities. And they help us feel part of something larger than our individual lives.